When Keanu Reeves walked into the studio holding a Bible, no one knew what was coming. But Jonathan Roumie, the actor who plays Jesus, would be in tears within minutes. What began as a simple interview turned into a moment of raw truth that neither man could have scripted. So what did Keanu reveal? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The studio was unlike any Keanu Reeves had entered before. No audience, no applause, just a dimly lit space with two chairs facing each other beneath a warm, diffused light. The walls didn't hum with excitement. Instead, they held a quiet stillness, as though even the air was waiting for something sacred to unfold. Keanu arrived early, as he always did, but this time with something different in his hands, something that felt heavier than any script he'd ever held. A Bible. Worn leather cover, frayed edges, gold-leafed pages dulled by time. It had belonged to his grandfather, untouched for decades, resting in a drawer until 3 months ago. That morning, for reasons he couldn't explain, he brought it with him. He stood near the edge of the set, thumbing the corner of the cover. Not reading, just holding. The weight of it wasn't just paper. It was history. Loss, memory. Something deeper than words. Across the room, Jonathan Roumie stepped in through the side entrance. Dressed modestly, his eyes lit up when he noticed Keanu already there. But then his steps slowed as his gaze fell on the Bible resting against Keanu's palm. A small furrow formed between his brows. "Mr. Reeves," Jonathan said, walking closer and extending a hand. "Didn't expect to see that." Keanu shook his hand, his grip firm, then glanced down at the Bible. "I didn't either," he said quietly. "I wasn't planning to bring it, but something told me I shouldn't leave it behind." The crew moved quietly around them, adjusting cameras and lighting. No one interrupted. No chatter, no rehearsals, just an air of anticipation that hung like a veil between the present and something deeper. Jonathan offered a gentle smile. "Is this your first time speaking publicly about this?" Keanu nodded once. "I've never said it out loud. Not to anyone who didn't already know loss, but now, I think I need to say it." Jonathan didn't press him. He simply gestured toward the two chairs under the lights. They took their places, the studio still holding its breath. A lone red light on the camera blinked once, then stayed steady. The signal that the recording had begun. Keanu cleared his throat softly. His thumb brushed the edge of the Bible again, then rested his hands in his lap. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, with a voice that cracked just slightly beneath the surface, he began. "Something happened to me, and I think I need to say it now." The words weren't rehearsed. They weren't delivered like lines. They rose from somewhere much deeper, somewhere quiet and scarred. Jonathan looked over, silent but present, and in that pause, in that sacred stillness, two men sat, not as actors, not as public figures, but as humans, holding space for something far more real than either of them expected. Jonathan didn't respond right away. He simply nodded and leaned forward slightly, letting Keanu have the space he needed. The cameras were rolling, but no one spoke from behind them. The studio wasn't just silent, it felt sacred. Keanu took a long breath. His eyes weren't looking into the lens or even at Jonathan. They stared downward toward the Bible resting in his lap, like the words had to rise from that place first. "I don't do interviews like this," he said softly. "Not because I don't want to talk, but because I never really knew what was worth saying." He looked up for the first time, his eyes carrying a quiet weight. "I've played so many characters who faced death, pain, violence. John Wick, Neo, Constantine. But all those stories, they let me hide behind something. Let me explore grief without having to name my own." Jonathan listened, his face still and focused. But something shifted, Keanu continued. 3 months ago, I was alone in Berlin. We'd just wrapped filming on a pretty dark movie. I couldn't sleep. Couldn't stop thinking about all the loss in my life. My daughter, Jennifer, River, even my father. His voice tightened on that last name, but he kept going. I've always wrestled with that pain quietly, meditated on it, tried to make peace with it. But that night in Berlin, it wasn't quiet anymore. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. There was no sound, no dream I could remember, just this awareness. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing with careful curiosity. Keanu nodded slowly. It was like someone was in the room, but not physically, not like a person walking in. It felt like light. Not from the lamp, not from the moon, not even light you could really see, just presence. He paused again. A trembling breath escaped him. I don't even know how to explain it without sounding strange. But in that moment, I wasn't scared. I felt known, completely known, like every wall I'd built around my grief, my guilt, my anger had just dissolved. The words landed like a soft thunder, quiet but undeniable. Jonathan didn't rush him. He folded his hands gently, his brow drawn, not in confusion, but in something close to awe. Keanu looked down at his hands. I didn't hear a voice, not exactly, but I understood something that didn't feel like it came from me. He swallowed hard. I felt held, not judged, not evaluated, just held. And the message that came to me wasn't complicated, it was simple, but it was like it cut right through me. He looked up again, this time locking eyes with Jonathan. Your suffering is not without meaning. Jonathan blinked. His mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. The words echoed, not just in the studio, but somewhere deeper. Everyone in the room felt it. Whether they believed or not, they felt it. Keanu sat back slightly in his chair. I didn't know what to do with that sentence. I just let it settle inside me. He gently placed the Bible on the small table between them. That morning, I opened this for the first time in decades, and it fell open to the Gospel of John. He slid the ribbon marker between the pages, revealing the verse. John 11:25. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Jonathan's lips pressed together, his fingers curled slightly in his lap. Keanu's voice grew quiet. That verse didn't feel like literature. It felt like an answer. The air in the studio thickened with stillness. The cameras were still rolling, but no one behind them dared shift or make a sound. It felt like the moment demanded more than attention. It asked for reverence. Jonathan Roumie leaned forward slightly, his voice low, careful. Keanu, do you believe it? That verse? Keanu's eyes lingered on the open Bible, then slowly lifted to meet Jonathan's gaze. I do, he said. I don't have all the theology figured out. I'm not a preacher. I don't come from a church background. But when I read those words that morning, something in me just said, yeah. He paused again, but this time it was not hesitation. It was clarity forming in real time. I've spent a lifetime chasing meaning through stories, roles where pain turns into power, where vengeance looks like justice, where broken men try to put themselves back together by any means necessary. But none of them gave me what that moment did. Jonathan nodded slowly, visibly moved but holding it in. And now, Keanu continued, tapping the edge of the Bible, I think I'm beginning to understand that it's not just about overcoming pain. It's about letting it point you to something deeper, maybe even someone. There was a long silence. Then Keanu said, barely above a whisper, This is the first time I've said it out loud, but I think I met Jesus that night. Jonathan's breath caught. The truth hung in the room like a note struck on a bell that refused to fade. No reaction, no applause, just presence, just truth. Keanu's hands rested gently on the Bible now. I didn't come here to make headlines. I came because something happened. And if I've learned anything in the past few months, it's that some truths are too important to carry alone. Jonathan swallowed hard. Thank you for sharing that. Truly. Keanu gave a small, humble nod. I wasn't sure if I could, but I think I needed to. As the camera lights dimmed slightly for a scheduled lighting reset, neither man moved. They just sat there, facing each other, two artists and two souls, sitting in the wake of something holy. Keanu took a deep breath before speaking again. The room was still, as if it too had paused to listen. It started in Berlin, he said softly. 3 months ago. Jonathan turned slightly in his seat. He didn't interrupt, just waited. I was filming a psychological thriller, Keanu continued. Dark subject matter, revenge, despair. The kind of story that leaves residue on your soul even after the cameras stop rolling. He paused, fingers resting lightly on the edge of the Bible still beside him. I've done a lot of those roles, he admitted. And for years, I thought I could just shake them off. But this one hit different. Maybe it was the setting. Berlin is a city haunted by memory. Or maybe it was just time. He looked up. I started dreaming about Jennifer again, and River, even Ava. The silence stretched gently between them. Jonathan's eyes softened. I've spent most of my adult life trying not to drown in those losses, Keanu said. I used work like a life raft. But in Berlin, I couldn't float anymore. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating, and then, one night, he leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on a point in the distance. I woke up, not from a dream, just woke up. He rubbed his hands together, slowly. The clock said 3:07 IME. I hadn't heard anything, no noise, no dream, just this. Presence. Jonathan's brow furrowed slightly, not in skepticism, but in anticipation. The air felt thick, Keanu said, but not heavy, not oppressive, just full, like the room itself had changed. He exhaled slowly. I wasn't afraid. That's what's strange. I should have been. I live alone, my hotel room was locked. But instead of panic, I felt peace. Like something had entered the room and wasn't there to harm me. Just to be there. He paused again. I didn't see anyone. There were no voices, no figures. Just this awareness. A light. Not from the window, not from the lamp, not even the kind of light you see with your eyes. Jonathan was completely still now. It was like something opened inside me, Keanu said. And in that opening, I felt seen. Completely. Not like how a fan sees you on the street. Not like how a camera sees you. I mean seen in a way that stripped everything else away. My fame, my pain, my questions. It was like I was just me. And that was enough. He looked down, then back up again. And in that stillness, a phrase came. Not a voice, just a knowing. Keanu's eyes brimmed, but his voice stayed steady. Your suffering is not without meaning. Jonathan sat completely still. The cameras didn't move. No one behind them so much as shifted in their seat. It was as if the whole room leaned forward in silence, just to catch Keanu's next breath. Fade the pain, Keanu said. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't answer all my questions, but it held me like nothing ever had. He rested a hand on the Bible again, fingers tracing the frayed edge of the cover. 4 years, he said, I carried grief like armor. Jennifer, River, Ava. I didn't know how to put it down. I didn't even know I could. His voice cracked gently, not from performance but from memory. I tried everything. I read every book I could, philosophies, practices, retreats. I learned how to numb, how to detach, how to appear okay even when I wasn't. He paused. But that night in Berlin, I didn't feel the need to detach. I felt allowed to feel it all and still be okay. Allowed to be broken and still held. He looked up again. Whatever that presence was, it didn't ask me to fix myself. It didn't offer advice. It just stayed. And I think that's what made it different. Jonathan finally spoke, softly. Do you think it was him? Keanu's eyes didn't waver. Yes, he said. I do. There was no performance in his voice, no dramatic emphasis, just quiet, firm belief. I didn't grow up religious, he explained, and I've never belonged to any particular tradition. I've studied Buddhism, Taoism. I've practiced stillness, but none of those ever made me feel known. He tilted his head slightly. In that moment, I wasn't Keanu the actor. I wasn't someone famous. I wasn't someone broken either. I was just me. And it felt like that was enough. That I didn't have to perform for God. That I didn't have to earn peace. Jonathan nodded slowly. That's rare. Keanu gave a small, almost surprised smile. That's what I thought. He took another breath, slower this time, letting the weight of his words settle. And the weird thing is, he said, I didn't want the moment to end. I didn't want to question it or explain it or make sense of it. I just wanted to stay in it. He looked over at Jonathan. But the light began to fade. He mimicked the motion with his hands, like watching the slow departure of something sacred. It didn't vanish all at once. It receded, gently, like it was never trying to prove anything, just to be there for the moment I needed it most. He paused, then added, and when it was gone, I didn't feel empty. I felt full. Jonathan's eyes were glassy now, and I knew something had shifted inside me. I didn't understand it, but I knew I couldn't go back to pretending I hadn't been touched by something real. Keanu sat with his hands gently clasped, elbows resting on his knees. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of someone who had walked through fire and found something unexpected on the other side. When I woke up the next morning, he said, I thought it might have just been a dream, but the feeling, it was still there, not loud, not even emotional, just quiet, steady, like something had been anchored deep inside me. He looked at Jonathan, then slowly placed the Bible on the small table between them. I didn't know what to do with what I'd felt, so I reached for this, my grandfather's Bible. It's been in my house for years, never opened it, not once. But that morning, I did. His fingers hovered over the ribbon that marked the place he'd left at last. I didn't plan where to turn. I just opened it. And the page I landed on, he flipped it slowly, revealing it to Jonathan. It said, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Jonathan whispered the verse under his breath, as if it were part of his own memory. His eyes didn't move from the page. I've played men obsessed with revenge, men who lose everything and survive by hurting others, Keanu said quietly. But reading that verse, it didn't feel like literature. It felt like something alive, like truth. There was a pause, not awkward, not forced, just sacred. Kept thinking about that light, Keanu said, that moment of peace, and I realized for the first time I didn't feel alone in my grief. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. I've lost so much. I've carried so much. And that night in Berlin didn't take the pain away, but it showed me something I hadn't dared hope for. He looked up, his voice steadied. Maybe, just maybe, my suffering wasn't meaningless. Jonathan's voice was soft. And that changes Everything. Keanu nodded. It does. Because if suffering isn't meaningless, then neither is love. Neither is memory. Neither is the ache we carry for the people we've lost. He paused, then said the phrase again, slowly this time. Your suffering is not without meaning. The crew behind the cameras remained still. No rustle of scripts, no buzz of equipment, just silence. The kind that only truth knows how to fill. Jonathan swallowed hard. That's more than comfort. That's a kind of invitation. Keanu met his gaze. Exactly. Not an escape, but an entry point. And with that, the air in the room felt heavier. Not with burden, but with something close to reverence. Jonathan leaned forward, his fingertips barely touching as they rested in his lap. His eyes didn't drift. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. Something in the way Keanu spoke, low, unpolished, deliberate, made it impossible to look away. The studio had grown even quieter, as if it were holding its breath with him. Keanu let his words hang for a moment. Then he spoke again. All my life I've searched for peace in silence, he said. Zen retreats, meditation, solitude. I thought if I could just get quiet enough, I'd finally outrun the pain. He glanced up at Jonathan, not looking for pity, just clarity. But this, what happened in Berlin, it wasn't silence. It wasn't stillness. It was presence. Jonathan's eyebrows furrowed, a subtle nod encouraging him to go deeper. Keanu reached into the side pocket of his worn black coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in a linen cloth. He slowly unfolded it, revealing a Bible, worn, edges curled, its leather soft with time. It was my grandfather's, he said. I never touched it. I carried it around like a memory, not a guide. His fingers traced the cover, then gently opened it. I don't know why I did it that morning. I didn't expect anything. I just opened it. He paused, flipping carefully to a page that had been marked with a faded scrap of yellowed paper. The page it fell to was John 11:25. He looked over at Jonathan, who nodded solemnly, familiar with the verse. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Keanu let the words echo in the air. His voice hadn't cracked, but his throat had tightened. It was the kind of stillness that made everyone in the room feel like they'd stepped into something sacred. I'd read scriptures before, Keanu continued, for roles or as literature, but this didn't feel like words on a page. It felt spoken. He closed the Bible and laid it softly on the table between them. Jonathan's voice was quiet. Did you believe it? Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor, then up, not avoiding the question, just making sure he said it with truth. In that moment, I did, he said, completely. There was no dramatic swell of music, no applause, no cue cards, just that one sentence, steady and calm. And the entire room leaned into it. Jonathan blinked slowly. And after? Keanu smiled faintly, a sadness beneath the gratitude. Belief didn't vanish, but it got tested. He took a breath, then added softly, it still is. Jonathan sat back slightly, processing the weight of what had just been said. His expression was more than empathy. It was understanding. He had played Jesus on screen, but here, across from him, was a man speaking about an encounter that had rewritten the lines of his own story. Keanu leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, fingers interlaced. His voice was steady now, but still gentle. You know, for most of my life, I've believed in something greater. I explored Buddhism, read about the Tao, found solace in the idea of impermanence. It helped, for a time, gave me language for the silence I felt inside. But he looked toward the camera lights, not directly, just near them, as if recalling something deeper than sight. This wasn't like that. This wasn't letting go of pain. It was being seen inside it. That night in Berlin, I wasn't asked to detach from grief. I was invited to let it speak. He looked back at Jonathan. And what it said broke me open. Jonathan shifted in his seat, his eyes now glassy. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I'd spent so long managing loss, Keanu continued. My daughter, Jennifer, River. I'd built walls around those memories, carried them like stones in my pockets, always heavy, always private. But that night, it felt like someone else was carrying them with me. A tear slid silently down someone's cheek in the front row of the audience, though no one turned to look. The focus remained on the two men seated at the center of the room. One actor who had played Christ, and another who had quietly met him in the dark. I didn't wake up the next morning with all the answers, Keanu said, but I did wake up with a question I hadn't asked in years. What if this pain means something? What if it's not just what I've survived, but something that's shaping who I'm becoming? Jonathan finally broke his silence. That sounds like the beginning of healing. Keanu nodded slowly. Yeah, but not the kind I expected. Not forgetting, not fixing, just no longer hiding. He reached out again and touched the Bible softly. After that night, I started reading more. Not as an academic, not to debate theology, just to understand who this Jesus really is. Beyond culture, beyond cliché. He paused, then added, what I found wasn't a distant teacher. It was someone who walked into grief instead of avoiding it. Someone who wept, who bled, who didn't escape suffering but stood right in the middle of it. Jonathan's eyes brimmed. I don't think people realize how rare it is to hear that, he whispered, especially from someone like you. Keanu shook his head gently. I'm not saying it because I've figured it out. I'm saying it because I couldn't ignore it anymore. Keanu glanced down at the Bible again. His thumb traced the edge of the page like it was something sacred, something he'd once feared and now quietly cherished. I didn't grow up in a religious home, he said softly. And when I started acting, I think I used work as a kind of shield. I could explore emotions, grief and loss through characters. But when the director yelled, "Cut," I was still carrying the same ache I walked in with. He looked up. This was different. It wasn't performance. It wasn't therapy. It was presence. I wasn't explaining anything. I was being held in it. Jonathan whispered, that changes everything. It did, Keanu said. But it also left me unsettled. Because once you've had a moment like that, the silence afterward feels louder. I kept asking myself, was it real? Was I losing my mind? Was it just exhaustion? And what answered you? Jonathan asked. Keanu smiled faintly. This book, he said, holding up the Bible again, I started reading every night, and the more I read, the more I realized. What I experienced didn't contradict what Jesus said. It confirmed it. Jonathan looked curious, leaning forward slightly. What do you mean? Keanu opened to a marked page. John 11:25, he said. It's the verse the Bible fell open to that morning. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. He let the verse hang in the air. I've done so many films about vengeance, death, survival, Keanu continued. But this verse wasn't about surviving. It was about something deeper, something eternal, and it didn't feel like poetry. It felt like truth. Jonathan was silent again, not from disbelief, but reverence. And in that moment, Keanu said slowly, I believed it, completely. Not because someone told me to, not because I was trying to be spiritual. I believed it because everything in me recognized it. He exhaled, and that scared me more than anything. Jonathan tilted his head. Why? Because if it's true, Keanu said, then everything I've built my worldview on needs to shift. I can't just walk away from that kind of moment. I can't treat it like a phase. There was a pause. So I started walking toward it, slowly, quietly, letting it change me, even if I didn't understand how. Jonathan leaned back, visibly moved. "That's not just belief," he said. "That's surrender." Keanu nodded. "And I wasn't sure I knew how to do that, but I knew I couldn't go back." The room was still again, but it wasn't emptiness. It was full of memory, mystery, and something sacred that didn't need music or spotlight to make itself known. Keanu sat forward slightly, the leather of his chair creaking under the shift, his voice quiet but unmistakably steady. "Halfway to Berlin, I couldn't sleep for weeks," he began. "But not because I was scared. It was something else, like something inside me had opened and couldn't be closed again. So I kept reading." He motioned gently toward the Bible still resting on the table between them. "I didn't start with Genesis or the Old Testament. I started with Matthew. And I didn't read like a scholar. I wasn't trying to figure out what it all meant. I just read like someone starving." Jonathan didn't interrupt. He just watched, brows drawn close, as Keanu took a breath. "The Jesus I found there wasn't what I expected. I always thought of him as peaceful, distant, sort of like a wise monk floating above the mess of the world." Keanu paused and shook his head faintly. "But this Jesus? He touched the untouchable. He flipped tables, he called out hypocrites, he forgave people others wanted to stone. He wept." There was a stillness in the room again, not uncomfortable, just respectful. Hanel didn't shy away from suffering. He didn't explain it away or call it an illusion. He entered it. Keanu looked down for a moment, like the memory of his own pain had just walked back in through a door he didn't close fast enough. "When I read the Beatitudes, especially the line, 'Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted,' it hit me, like a wave I didn't see coming." He tapped the edge of the Bible softly. "I used to think grief was a weakness, that pain was something you got through by numbing it or rising above it, that strength meant silence." He swallowed hard. "But Jesus called it holy." Jonathan shifted slightly in his seat, not to move away but to lean in. Whatever was unfolding between them wasn't scripted. It was sacred. I started thinking about all the years I spent avoiding my own sorrow, how I took roles that let me express it on screen, John Wick, Constantine, even Neo in his own way, but off-screen, I just didn't go there. Keanu glanced up. "And the more I read, the more I realized Jesus never asked people to suppress pain. He met them in it. And that was the shift." He looked Jonathan directly in the eyes now. "For the first time in my life, I wasn't reading to escape. I was reading to return." Jonathan's eyes were moist, his expression unreadable but clearly affected. "You saw something in those pages," he said softly. Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I saw someone who wasn't afraid of wounds, someone who didn't turn away from the bleeding places in people's lives. And I started to wonder." He stopped. Jonathan asked gently, "Wonder what?" Keanu's voice barely rose above a whisper. "If he wasn't afraid of theirs, maybe he wouldn't be afraid of mine either." Jonathan took a long breath, letting the weight of Keanu's words settle in the silence between them. "You weren't just reading a story," he said. "You were letting the story read you." Keanu gave a faint smile. "That's exactly what it felt like. Like the pages weren't asking me to agree or debate. They were asking me to be honest. And they weren't just speaking about a man who lived 2,000 years ago. They were speaking directly to me." He tapped the worn Bible again. "Every night I read another chapter, and every night something in me softened. Not all at once, not dramatically, but piece by piece." Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "What stood out most?" Keanu exhaled slowly. "The way Jesus treated the people everyone else had written off. Lepers, prostitutes, tax collectors, Roman soldiers. He didn't just heal their wounds, he saw them. He spoke to their pain. He looked down at his hands. For a long time, I thought strength meant having no needs, no weakness. But this, Jesus, he seemed to say the opposite, that you're strongest when you know your need. Jonathan's eyes softened. That's not easy to accept, especially in your world. In Hollywood? Keanu asked with a knowing smirk. Yeah. We celebrate invincibility. We praise the man who doesn't flinch, doesn't cry, doesn't break. But I think we've confused that for strength. He paused. You know what hit me the hardest? He said. It wasn't the miracles. It wasn't the parables. It was the moments when Jesus chose presence over power. Jonathan tilted his head. There's that scene, Keanu continued, where a woman touches his robe in the crowd. She believes just one touch will heal her, and Jesus stops. He turns around. He looks for her, not to scold, not to shame, but to see her. He looked up again, eyes focused now, and I thought, how many people walk through life just wanting to be seen, not fixed, not pitied, just seen? Jonathan swallowed hard. That sounds like a man who knows what it's like to be invisible. Keanu didn't flinch. Yeah. I've had nights where I stood in a room full of people and still felt utterly alone. But the more I read about Jesus, the more I realized he noticed the ones nobody else did. The room had fallen so still it felt like time itself had paused. Reading the Gospels started to feel less like religion, Keanu said quietly, and more like being invited into something, into someone. He closed his eyes briefly. Into grace. Jonathan's voice was softer now, almost reverent. Grace, he echoed. That's not a word we hear much anymore. Keanu nodded. It's not popular. It doesn't trend, but it's the only thing that's ever felt strong enough to hold my pain without trying to erase it. He turned slightly, looking beyond the camera lights, like he was addressing someone who might be listening on the other side of the screen. I used to think healing was about forgetting, about moving on. But Jesus never told anyone to move on. He told them to follow. Jonathan leaned back, arms crossed lightly, letting the thought breathe. That's different, he whispered. That's surrender. Keanu smiled faintly. Yeah, and I've never been good at surrender. I like control. I like knowing where the story ends. But the Gospels, they don't offer that kind of neat ending. They offer presence. They offer a person. He picked up the Bible and opened to the Beatitudes again. Blessed are those who mourn, he said. I used to skip over that. Now I can't stop reading it. Jonathan asked gently, why that verse? Keanu looked down, thumb gently pressing the page. Because it says something the world refuses to believe. That grief doesn't disqualify you. That sorrow doesn't make you less. It makes you seen. It makes you blessed. His voice caught slightly and he paused to breathe. And I needed that, he said. After losing Ava, after River, after Jennifer, I didn't need a theology. I needed a savior who weeps. Jonathan's eyes glistened. He nodded. Not with words, but with a shared ache. Keanu continued. I started to realize something. All my life, I'd been telling stories of pain, vengeance, survival. But I never told a story of healing, because I didn't believe it was possible. Until now. He glanced at Jonathan. It doesn't mean I'm fixed. It doesn't mean the grief is gone. It just means I'm not walking through it alone anymore. The lights above them seemed dimmer somehow, as if they were no longer part of a set, but of a sacred space. Keanu closed the Bible slowly. This book used to just be paper to me, history, literature. But now, it feels alive, like every word is breathing. Jonathan whispered, because now it's reading you back. Keanu nodded once. Exactly. And in that final moment, no music played, no dramatic closing line. Just silence, sacred, soft, the kind of silence that follows truth. The heat in Morocco was dry, thick with dust and silence between takes. Keanu had been filming a period drama about betrayal and legacy, heavy material that mirrored emotions he hadn't yet put to rest. During one brief pause in production, he wandered from the set, seeking a patch of shade and stillness. That's when a local man approached him. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with sun-worn skin and eyes that had seen too much grief. He didn't speak like a fan. He didn't ask for an autograph. He simply said, "Mr. Reeves, I lost my son 2 months ago." His voice didn't shake. It cracked in the places where it had been held together too long. Keanu didn't speak. He just nodded, gently, signaling he was listening. The man continued, "There was a movie you did. It helped me get through those first weeks. You lost someone too, yes?" Keanu gave a small, honest nod. "Then maybe," the man said, eyes fixed on him, "you can tell me something I've been carrying in my chest every night." Keanu braced himself. The man asked softly, "What do you think happens when we die?" Keanu exhaled, slowly. He had answered that question many times over the years, in interviews, in philosophy discussions, even in quiet moments alone. He had said things like, "I believe our energy transforms," or "consciousness shifts," but nothing's really gone. But none of those phrases felt enough right now. Not with this man, not with that kind of pain behind the question. Still, he gave the only answer he had in that moment. "I think our energy remains, that it moves on, becomes part of the world in some way." The man nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the ground. Then he looked up again and asked the question that broke something deep inside Keanu. "But does that mean I'll see my son again?" There was no sound after that. Just the wind brushing dust across the path behind them, and a silence that stretched further than Keanu knew how to fill. He had no answer, because suddenly energy and philosophy and recycled words weren't enough. They didn't hold in the face of a father's grief. They didn't offer peace, only distance. Keanu remembered standing there, frozen, the man's question echoing inside his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Something about that moment followed him back to his hotel. It stayed with him that night. And the next. Days later, back in his room, Keanu opened the Bible again, the same one he'd carried since Berlin. And again, it fell open to the page he hadn't yet moved the bookmark from. John 11:25. He read it aloud, not for performance, but because his soul needed to hear it. "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live." He read it again, slower, and this time something in him shifted. That verse, "though he die, yet shall he live," wouldn't let go of him. Keanu sat with it for nearly an hour, reading it again and again. Not as a line of text, not as a poetic comfort, but as if it were a direct answer to the Father's question. One he hadn't been able to give, one he now wished he could. He realized something in that quiet space. For years, he had turned to answers that sounded wise but lacked weight. Philosophy had offered him detachment, but it couldn't fill the hole left by a name. Ava, River, Jennifer. His daughter, his friend, his love. Each one taken too soon. Each one a wound that never closed, only scarred over. But what if those wounds weren't just the cost of living or karma or the randomness of a chaotic world? What if they weren't just things to accept, but things to redeem? Keanu closed the Bible and whispered aloud, "That's not a metaphor." His voice trembled, not from doubt, but from something else. Awe. "It's a promise." The next day on set, he couldn't shake the memory of the Moroccan father, couldn't stop thinking about the pain in his voice, the unbearable hope behind that simple question. Will I see my son again? He wanted to find the man, to give him a different answer, not just energy, not just transformation, but reunion, resurrection, life. Keanu didn't grow up in the church. He hadn't been raised on sermons or altar calls. His spiritual compass had always pointed inward, toward meditation, presence, stillness. But this felt different. This felt like someone stepping into his grief with him, not asking him to escape it. That night, after filming Wrapped, Keanu pulled out a notepad. He began writing, not for a role, not for press, but for himself. He wrote out the words, "Your grief is not the end of the story." Then below it, "Though he die, yet shall he live." The tears came slowly, not from sadness, but from the strange, almost frightening sensation of something healing. He thought again of River's last laugh, Jennifer's last voicemail, Ava's tiny heartbeat, all the goodbyes that had felt final. And for the first time in decades, he dared to ask himself, what if they weren't? A knock came at the hotel door. "Room service?" Keanu wiped his face and answered it. The young man pushing the cart looked up, wide-eyed. "Mr. Reeves?" Keanu smiled politely, nodded. The server hesitated. "I heard what you said on set yesterday, about loss." Keanu stood a little straighter. "Yeah, my brother died last year. I haven't heard anyone say anything that made it hurt less, but what you said..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "It still hurts," Keanu said quietly. "But maybe there's a kind of hope that doesn't erase the pain, just makes it bearable." The young man nodded, eyes glassy. "Thank you." Keanu closed the door, sat down at the small table, and opened the Bible again. The same page, the same verse. And now, it wasn't just an answer for a stranger. It was an answer for himself. When Keanu returned to Los Angeles, the noise of the world tried to pull him back into routine. Meetings, scripts, deals. But something had shifted. He wasn't the same man who had left for Berlin or Morocco. The grief hadn't vanished. But for the first time, it wasn't the only thing in the room with him. One evening, he sat across from a film executive who was pitching a new franchise. Violent, loud, revenge-driven. The old Keanu might have nodded along, might have been tempted to bury himself in the role, to escape again into someone else's pain. But this time, he asked a different question. "What's the point of this story?" The room fell silent. The executive cleared his throat. "It's exciting, it's marketable, it's what audiences want." Keanu smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Do they want violence, or do they want meaning? That question stayed with him. And so did another, one he now carried like a flame. What if stories could heal? What if they could point toward life, not just escape death? He started keeping a journal. Every page began with the same verse. "I am the resurrection and the life." And beneath it he wrote prayers. Not always polished, not always certain, but honest. He wrote to God like a man reaching towards someone who had already reached for him. One night, alone in his home, Keanu read a commentary on John 11. It said, "Jesus wept because death is not what we were made for. He came to undo it, not just accept it." Keanu whispered aloud, "Undo it." He thought of Ava again, and for the first time in years, he let himself smile, not from memory, but from hope. The next day, he called his assistant. "Can you track down the contact for that Moroccan father?" She hesitated. "From the set?" "Yeah, I think I owe him a new answer." 2 weeks later, the man answered Keanu's call. His voice cracked, just hearing Keanu's name. "I've been praying you'd call." Keanu swallowed hard. "I didn't have the words before, but I do now." There was silence on the line. Then Keanu spoke, his voice steady. "Yes, I believe you will see your son again." He paused, breath-catching. "Because I believe in the one who defeated death." The man sobbed quietly. Keanu said nothing else. He didn't need to. The phone call ended, but the transformation didn't. Later that night, he returned to his grandfather's Bible. Flipping past the bookmarked page, he saw a line underlined in faint pencil, one he hadn't noticed before. "It will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more." It felt like a promise stitched into the fabric of every loss he had ever endured. Grief would not be the end. Love would not be buried forever. And the story, his story, was not over yet. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice quieter than before. "For years, I explored every belief system that spoke to suffering. Buddhism taught me detachment, Zen taught me stillness, philosophy gave me frameworks, but none of them let me feel held. They all asked me to rise above pain. Jesus, he entered it." Jonathan Roumie watched him intently, moved not as an actor, but as a man listening to another man's private ache unfold in the open. The lights on set were soft, but the silence between them felt sacred, like a confession shared between friends, not public figures. Keanu continued, his eyes never straying far from the Bible resting beside him. "When I read that Jesus wept at Lazarus's tomb, even knowing resurrection was moments away, that's when something cracked open in me. He wasn't avoiding grief. He stood in it. With them. With all of us." He paused, swallowing gently. "I've carried loss like it was my shadow. Jennifer, Ava, River. I tried to keep walking, thinking strength meant not stopping to grieve, but Jesus didn't sprint past pain. He stopped. He stayed. He cried." Jonathan shifted in his seat and spoke for the first time in a while. "When we started filming The Chosen, I thought playing Jesus would mean showing strength through peace. But the more I stepped into him, the more I realized the real strength was vulnerability." Keanu nodded, his face softening. That word, vulnerability, I never liked it. Not in my line of work. In this industry, we're taught to hide anything soft. It's always about image, control, emotional armor. But when I sat with that verse, Jesus wept, I felt like I was being told, you can put the armor down now. You don't have to carry this alone. He looked up, eyes glistening but steady. It was the first time in my life I thought, maybe grief isn't something I have to escape. Maybe it's something sacred. Jonathan drew in a breath, then quietly replied, "You just described everything I felt filming season 2, especially the scene where Jesus heals the leper." The entire crew went silent after the take, because in that moment we all felt something real, not just acting, presence. Keanu smiled faintly, as if remembering something personal. "That's the word, isn't it? Presence." Jesus didn't offer escape. He offered presence. A hand in the fire, a voice in the storm. Jonathan nodded slowly. "And when you know someone is in it with you, the pain changes. It doesn't go away, but it doesn't win." Keanu turned toward him and whispered, "That's what I've been missing. All these years. Not answers, not clarity, just someone beside me." Jonathan sat back in his chair, letting Keanu's last words settle. "You know," he said, "when I first got cast as Jesus, I was terrified. I didn't feel qualified, I still don't. But one thing I clung to was that moment in Scripture when Jesus meets people right where they are, hurting, confused, even angry, and doesn't pull away." Keanu tilted his head slightly, listening with the quiet intensity of someone hungry for truth, not performance. Jonathan continued, "I spent months trying to understand what it meant to carry someone else's pain on camera. But eventually I realized you don't carry it by pretending to be above it. You carry it by getting close enough to feel it yourself." Keanu nodded slowly. I used to think being strong meant staying stoic. But silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's fear. Fear that if you let the grief speak, it'll never stop. His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't shy away from it. I kept everything locked up, my daughter, my partner, my best friend. I never talked about them because I didn't want to be the guy who couldn't move on. But the truth is, I never did. I just hid it well. Jonathan leaned forward. You don't have to anymore. There was a long pause. The cameras kept rolling, but no one dared interrupt. Even the crew stood still, some with arms folded tight, others visibly emotional. Keanu reached for the Bible again, this time flipping through the pages with calm purpose. I read something in Isaiah that shook me. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. That line, it was like looking in a mirror. He placed his hand gently over the page. For the first time, I didn't feel like grief was something to get rid of. I felt like it was something Jesus understood, that he'd been there. Jonathan nodded, eyes glistening. And that changes the whole story, doesn't it? Because if Jesus knows suffering, if he lived it, then it's not just a theological concept. It's a shared experience. Keanu looked up, voice low. Exactly. That night in Berlin, I didn't see a figure of religion. I felt a presence that knew my pain and didn't run from it. That didn't shame me. That just stayed. He sat back for a moment, quiet. I think that's the kind of love I've been chasing my whole life. Not the love that fixes everything, just the love that stays when nothing can be fixed. Jonathan whispered, That's the love people are dying to know. Keanu rested his palms on the Bible, not gripping it, just holding it like something familiar, something steady. I used to walk into movie sets, red carpets, interviews, surrounded by people but completely alone inside. I'd smile, shake hands, answer questions, but I always had this quiet ache, like I was waiting for someone to ask a question no one ever asked. Jonathan looked up. What question? Keanu met his eyes. Are you okay carrying all that by yourself? The air between them felt still again, but not because of tension. Because something honest had just cracked open. And the truth was, Keanu continued, I wasn't okay. I was just good at pretending I was. Until that moment in Berlin. Until I felt something, or someone, say, you don't have to carry it alone anymore. That's when I started to break in a different way. Not fall apart. Breaking. Opening. Breaking. Jonathan leaned back, breathing deep. That's how healing starts. Keanu nodded. I think so. And reading the Gospels, it wasn't the miracles that kept me turning pages. It was the way Jesus moved toward people in pain. He never hurried them. He never looked away. He just stayed. And I realized, if God can do that, then maybe I can stop running. Jonathan placed a hand over his heart. Keanu, what you're describing, it's not religion, it's relationship. Keanu smiled faintly. I'm beginning to see that now. I always thought I had to earn peace, that I had to meditate more, detach better, grieve quieter. But Jesus didn't ask me to do anything first. He just came close. He stepped into the mess and stayed. That's not something you perform your way into. That's something you surrender to. There was no applause, no scripted transitions, just the gentle hum of silence, thick with meaning. Jonathan spoke one last time, voice soft but clear. When I was preparing for my role in The Chosen, I kept wondering if I'd ever meet someone who really understood what Jesus meant when he said, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened." I think I just did. Keanu looked at him, eyes glassy but at peace. And I think I finally did too. As the studio remained quiet, the presence of something deeper filled the space. Not celebrity, not performance. Just two men, both once strangers, now bonded by the mystery of grace that walks into pain and stays. Keanu sat forward slightly, fingers gently clasped as he looked down at the worn edge of the coffee table between them. The studio lights had softened now, no longer performing for the camera, but illuminating something more raw, something honest. "You know," he began quietly, "I've played a lot of men who've lost everything." Jonathan listened, leaning in with the kind of presence that didn't push or pry. "John Wick," Keanu said slowly. "He's a man whose world collapses in one moment, a gift from his dying wife, stolen, a dog. But it wasn't just a dog. It was the last piece of love he had. That character's grief, that rage, it wasn't fictional for me." Jonathan's eyes softened. Keanu's voice deepened. "I took that role not because I wanted to be in another action film. I took it because it let me scream without actually screaming. It let me express a kind of agony that I didn't know how to put into words at the time." He paused, and the quiet between them stretched, sacred. "I look back now," he continued, "and I see something I didn't see then. That I was using those stories as a mirror, as a shield, as a way to act out pain, loss, vengeance, without ever confronting my own." He glanced at Jonathan, then added, "Neo, too, a man caught between two worlds, searching for something real in a place full of illusion. I related to that more than I care to admit." "And Constantine? A man haunted by demons, both literally and internally, trying to buy redemption with actions instead of surrender." Jonathan gave a small nod, eyes beginning to mist. He knew what it meant when art wasn't just art, but survival. "For a long time," Keanu said, his voice lower now, "I thought those roles were helping me heal. Maybe they did a little. But mostly, they just let me stay hidden. It's easier to weep in a character's skin than in your own." He reached over and gently touched the Bible resting on the table, like grounding himself in something steadier. "It wasn't until I started reading the Gospels, really reading them, that I realized Jesus never avoided suffering. He didn't act it out. He entered into it, fully." Jonathan whispered, "That's a different kind of script." Keanu looked up, eyes steady. "Yeah, one where the hero doesn't fight back with fists or bullets. One where love doesn't destroy the enemy. It forgives them." He sat back then, the words hanging in the air. "And that made me ask myself a hard question," Keanu said slowly. "What if I've been telling stories that end with revenge because I didn't believe healing was even possible?" Jonathan exhaled softly, the silence between them full of things neither of them needed to say out loud. Keanu sat in stillness, as if the question he had just asked was still answering itself in his spirit. Then he leaned forward again, voice gentler now, the sharp edge of earlier reflections softened by clarity. "I used to think revenge was catharsis," he said, "that if I could just play it out on screen, I wouldn't have to feel it off screen. But all it did was bury the grief deeper." Jonathan nodded slowly, hands clasped between his knees. He understood. Not just as an actor, as a man. "There's this moment," Keanu continued, "in the second John Wick film. He's staring at a picture of his wife, and there's this stillness. That wasn't acting. That was me remembering Jennifer, remembering Ava, wondering what I would give to hear their voices again." The air in the studio seemed to shift, almost to kneel. "I didn't want to talk about it," Keanu added, "because grief makes people uncomfortable. It scares them, and when it scared them, I felt like I had to carry it alone." Jonathan whispered, "You don't anymore." Keanu offered a soft smile, grateful but quiet. Then he said something that made the room hold its breath. "I think I've spent half my life telling stories where healing never happens, Only vengeance does. And now? I don't want to do that anymore. Jonathan straightened slightly, eyes intent. Keanu nodded. I want to tell stories where redemption is possible, where the person in pain isn't destroyed or turned into a weapon, but transformed. He paused, then added, For so long I thought pain had to be strong, that suffering had to be loud to be meaningful. But Jesus didn't yell. He didn't retaliate. He absorbed it, Jonathan whispered, and he changed everything. Keanu looked toward the side of the studio, thoughtful. I used to read scripts asking, can I handle this emotionally? Now I ask, does this offer hope? Because that's what I want to put into the world. Jonathan blinked a few times, trying to stay composed. You just changed the way I'll read my next script, he said. Keanu gave a faint smile, his voice barely above a whisper. I think a lot of actors are grieving in secret. We take on these roles that mirror our hurt, but we rarely ask what kind of healing they lead to. He rested his hand on the Bible again. This, he said quietly, showed me a better ending. Jonathan looked at him, humbled. You mean the cross? Keanu nodded. Yeah. It was the first story I'd ever read where the hero doesn't win by destroying his enemies, but by forgiving them. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was holy. Keanu's fingers tapped gently against the edge of the Bible on the table, his eyes steady and filled with a quiet fire. You know, he said, voice low but clear, we celebrate power so much in storytelling. Guns, vengeance, domination. I get it. I've made a career out of it. But I've started to ask, what kind of power actually changes people? He paused, letting the weight of the question rest between them. Jonathan leaned in slightly, waiting. I don't think it's revenge, Keanu said. I think it's forgiveness. His words settled with such simplicity that no one dared speak. He let the stillness do its work before continuing. There was a moment a few months ago when I was rereading the crucifixion story. I've seen it portrayed in film. I've read the summaries. But something new hit me that night. Jesus, already beaten, bleeding, mocked, still finds breath to say, Father, forgive them. And I thought, how does a man do that? Jonathan's voice cracked slightly. He chose mercy instead of justice. Keanu nodded. And I realized I've never played that character, not really. I've never played the man who absorbs the pain and responds with love. He looked away for a moment, almost embarrassed by his own vulnerability. Maybe because I didn't know that was even an option. Jonathan's hand pressed gently against his chest. You do now, Keanu breathed in deeply. That's why I've started saying no to certain roles. Not because I'm judging others, but because I'm finally discerning the cost of what I put into the world. He leaned forward. If I take on a role that glorifies vengeance without showing the weight of it, if I pretend pain is only useful when weaponized, I'm not telling the truth anymore. I'm just repeating a cycle. Jonathan added softly, and the cycle never heals. Keanu looked down at the table. I don't want to be another echo of violence dressed up as purpose. I want to show what it looks like when a person walks through suffering and comes out gentler, not harder. There was a pause, then Jonathan asked, So, what kind of stories are you drawn to now? Keanu smiled faintly. The kind where someone gets a second chance. Where brokenness doesn't mean uselessness. Where love, real, messy, costly love, has the final say. He looked back up at Jonathan. Stories like the gospel? Jonathan swallowed hard. That's the most beautiful mission I've heard in a long time. Keanu nodded, slowly. I think people are hungry for those stories. We're tired of the fake strength. We want something true. His voice dropped. I want to honor the pain I've lived through, but I want to honor it by showing that it doesn't have to define me forever. Another pause. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Jonathan finally said. "You've spent decades showing us what it means to survive grief. Now you're showing us what it means to be transformed by it." Keanu didn't respond right away. He simply nodded again, then said, "I think my next role will be the hardest one yet." Jonathan tilted his head. "What's that?" Keanu smiled gently. "A man who forgives." And for a moment, it was as if everyone watching knew this wasn't the end of Keanu's story. It was just the beginning of a very different one. The studio air was still, yet something inside Keanu had begun to stir. He hadn't meant to talk about his father, not today, maybe not ever. But the silence that followed his words about redemption wasn't empty. It was an invitation. And sometimes the most painful truths rise through the quiet. He looked down at his hands. Then, slowly, he raised his eyes to Jonathan. "There's something I've carried longer than any role," he said softly. "And it's not a script or a loss. It's my father." Jonathan's posture shifted, gentler now. He didn't ask a question, he just listened. Keanu spoke slowly, like each word was being translated from a place he rarely visited. "My father left when I was young. There wasn't a dramatic goodbye. Just silence. He disappeared. Sometimes a letter, sometimes nothing. And I tried not to care. I tried to act like I didn't need him." He paused, inhaled, then continued. "I told myself I didn't need a father figure, that I'd be my own man, and I did it. I worked. I built something. But underneath that, there was always this ache. Not loud, just constant." Jonathan nodded slowly. "That kind of absence echoes." Keanu looked over, grateful someone understood. "I built an identity out of that ache. I used it. Channeled it. Most people don't realize a lot of the anger in my characters didn't come from fiction. It came from me. From the part of me that still wanted to ask why. There was a stillness in the crew. Even the camera operator stopped shifting. I didn't talk about it. Ever. But grief, when it doesn't get air, it doesn't disappear. It hardens." He ran a hand through his hair, then let it fall. "And then one night, a few months ago, I was reading the Gospels again. It wasn't for research or anything. It was just part of my new rhythm. And I came across a line I've read before. Plenty of times. But that night it read me." He looked directly at Jonathan. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Jonathan's expression softened instantly. He knew the weight of that line, knew it in his bones. Keanu went on. "I remember reading it aloud, then just sitting there, holding the page. I thought about how, even in agony, Jesus wasn't holding on to bitterness. Even while dying, he was releasing." A long pause followed, and then Keanu said something he had never said publicly before. "And I broke. I mean really broke. Not with anger, not with drama. Just this quiet collapse of something I had been keeping upright for decades. I wept for my father. Not for what he did, but for what he couldn't do. For what he couldn't give. And maybe for what he never received himself." Jonathan's eyes were glassy. "Not as an actor, as a man." Keanu continued, voice steady but hushed. "That's when I started praying every night. Not for peace, not for healing, just for forgiveness. For the people I've hurt. For the ones who hurt me, including my father." Jonathan whispered, "Was it hard?" Keanu gave a gentle smile. "It still is. There's this myth," Keanu said quietly, "that forgiveness is a moment, like flipping a switch, like saying a word makes it real." He looked up toward the overhead lights, then back at Jonathan. "But it's not. It's a practice. A choice you repeat even when you don't feel it, especially then." Jonathan nodded with quiet understanding. Keanu's voice stayed soft, but it carried weight. "I used to think forgiving my father would be letting him off the hook, that it would mean saying what he did didn't matter. But that's not what forgiveness is. It's not forgetting, it's not excusing, it's letting go of the need to make someone else bleed for your wound. He paused, because carrying the wound starts to feel like identity. You start thinking, this pain is who I am, and that's a lie. He folded his hands, steady now. I didn't forgive him because I'm noble. I forgave him because I was tired of carrying someone else's failure like it was my own. The crew remained completely still, not out of direction, out of respect. Jonathan leaned forward a little. Do you feel different now? Keanu considered the question before answering. Some days, yeah. Other days, I still feel the old story rise up. But now I know it's a story. It's not the ending. It's just a page I'm allowed to turn. Jonathan sat back, exhaling deeply. I started praying for him, Keanu added. Not that he'd come back, not even that he'd apologize. Just that wherever he is, he's at peace. That he knows I'm okay. That I don't hate him. Jonathan lowered his eyes. That's a powerful prayer. It's freedom, Keanu said. Not instant, but real. He let the silence settle before adding something more vulnerable. Sometimes I wonder who I might have become if he had stayed. But then I realize, maybe I became the man I am because he didn't. Jonathan smiled faintly. You turned your wound into a well. Keanu nodded once. I think that's what Jesus does. He doesn't erase pain. He transforms it. He tapped the Bible resting beside him. That one line, Father, forgive them, that changed how I pray. It changed how I speak, how I see other people. I don't always get it right, but I try. Jonathan looked over, visibly moved. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? Trying, showing up, letting grace lead instead of resentment. Exactly, Keanu said. It's not about perfection, it's about presence. There was a long, comfortable silence. No one rushed it. No one filled it. Because what had been said didn't need embellishment. It just needed to breathe. Keanu looked out beyond the cameras, as if speaking to the people on the other side of the screen. If anyone watching has carried the same wound, I just want them to know they're not alone. You can let go. You're allowed to stop punishing yourself for someone else's absence. He met Jonathan's gaze again. And sometimes, the most sacred thing we can do isn't shout our strength. It's whisper our release. Jonathan's eyes welled again, but he didn't speak. He didn't need to, because Keanu had just spoken for more people than he could ever know. The studio lights had dimmed slightly, not by design, but as if the moment demanded a gentler glow. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice steady but quieter than before. There's something I've never spoken about publicly, he said. Not because it's a secret, but because it's not something that needs attention. Jonathan Roumie turned his head slightly, listening closely. For the past year, Keanu continued, I've been visiting children's hospitals, quietly, no media, no handlers. No one even knows I'm coming, not even the kids. The room grew still, not a flicker of movement among the small audience. The tone had changed again, no longer reflective, but reverent. I walk in as someone who's known loss, Keanu said. Not as a movie star, not as Neo, not as John Wick. Just as someone who's held a child in his arms and never got to hold her again. Jonathan swallowed, his eyes already wet. I sit with parents, Keanu continued, who are watching their children slip away, and I don't try to inspire them. I don't say anything wise. Sometimes, I don't say anything at all. He paused. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. Sometimes, he said slowly, the most sacred thing is just showing up and staying. Jonathan lowered his gaze, visibly moved. That's ministry, he whispered. Keanu nodded, but gently. Not the kind with pulpits. The kind with plastic chairs and beeping machines. The kind where you hold someone's hand and say nothing because nothing would be enough anyway. He drew in a breath. One father told me he hadn't had a real conversation with someone outside the hospital in 2 weeks. He said I reminded him that his son mattered. Keanu looked toward the audience now. We wait for miracles, but sometimes being there is the miracle. Jonathan sat back, unable to speak, a hand covering his mouth briefly before he rested it on his knee. I've seen strength in those hospital rooms that no screen can capture, Keanu said. I've watched kids smile through unimaginable pain. I've watched mothers sing lullabies to children with only days left. And I've felt something in those rooms, something I never found on a red carpet. His voice softened further. You don't need answers in those moments. You need presence. You need someone who won't flinch when the grief gets too big. Jonathan exhaled slowly. You go there carrying your own loss, don't you? Keanu nodded. I go there with Ava's name written on my heart. And I carry her memory into every room, not to relive the pain, but to offer something real, something quiet. Another silence passed. No one in the room wanted to break it. I never introduce myself, Keanu added. If they recognize me, fine, but mostly I just listen. Sometimes they ask how I handle grief, sometimes they don't. But I stay. Jonathan leaned in slightly. What do you say when they ask how you've handled it? Keanu's eyes didn't move from the floor for a few seconds. Then he looked up, not to impress, but to confess. I tell them the truth, he said. That I didn't. Not for a long time. I ran from it. I buried myself in work, in other people's stories. I tried to escape mine. The audience hung on every word. His voice was slow, even, but there was a weight to it that filled the space. But lately, he said, I've started sharing what's helped me breathe again. Not a sermon, not a slogan, just something real. Jonathan's voice came quiet. Jesus. Keanu nodded. Yes. I don't always say his name out loud. Sometimes I just mention that I met someone who didn't look away from my grief, who stayed with me in it. He placed his hands together as if remembering. I tell them I used to believe peace came from escaping pain, but now I believe it comes from letting someone meet you inside it. Jonathan wiped at the corner of his eye. Keanu continued. One mother. Her daughter had just slipped into a coma. She asked me why I kept coming back. I told her it's because grief is a language I understand. And when you speak it, it doesn't echo as loud when someone else is there with you. There was a stillness again, a kind of holy hush that didn't need to be explained. I can't save anyone, Keanu said softly, but I can sit beside them while they wait. And sometimes that's enough. Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. That's what Jesus did. Exactly, Keanu said. He showed up. He didn't give people quick answers. He gave them his presence. He wept with them. He walked with them. That's what I'm trying to do, in my own small way. His voice dropped a bit lower, almost like a whisper. Sometimes all they want is someone who doesn't leave when things get dark. There was a pause. Then Keanu looked directly at Jonathan. I don't go because I'm strong, he said. I go because I remember what it felt like to feel alone in grief. And if sitting quietly in a hospital room gives someone 5 minutes of light, it's worth more than any movie I've ever made. A few people in the audience were now openly crying. Jonathan leaned forward, voice thick. That's not charity, that's compassion. Keanu nodded once. I'm not trying to be anyone's hero, I just want to be present for people who are holding on to love with every breath they've got left. The lights in the studio seemed warmer now, though no one had touched them. I don't bring cameras, Keanu added, because those moments aren't for headlines, they're sacred. You don't document sacred things, you live them. Quietly. Jonathan didn't speak for a moment. And then, gently, "I think maybe presence is the most powerful thing we can offer anyone." Keanu looked down, then back up. "It was offered to me," he said. "Now I offer it forward." Keanu leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, the Bible resting between his hands. The lights were still low, the room still quiet, but something in him had shifted. There was no need to perform now, no reason to guard what had always been hidden. "I used to think growth meant detachment," he said softly, "that if I could distance myself from pain, I could master it, that the higher ground was silence, stillness, letting go of things I couldn't control." Jonathan Roumie nodded slowly, resonating with the idea. Keanu continued, "But the more I read the Gospels, the more I realized Jesus didn't detach. He didn't rise above pain. He stepped into it, fully, deliberately." He turned to Matthew 5, a passage he now revisited almost every night. His fingers brushed across the thin paper like it was something living. "This part? The Sermon on the Mount? It wrecked me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan watched him carefully. "Why?" "Because it doesn't read like a motivational speech," Keanu replied. "It reads like a reversal, a total reordering of what we think matters." He read aloud, slowly, letting each word settle. "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek." He paused. "Those aren't the ones we celebrate in Hollywood, are they?" Jonathan smiled faintly. "Not really." Keanu shook his head. "We reward strength, fame, control, emotional armor. But here, Jesus is saying, no. He's saying the ones who are broken open are the ones closest to God. Not the perfect, not the polished. The grieving, the gentle, the hungry." He looked up, eyes glassy but unashamed. "That hit me hard. I've spent so much of my life trying to stay composed, trying to keep it all together. And here was someone saying, let it break. That's where the blessing is." Jonathan leaned forward now. "Do you think that's what your encounter in Berlin was about?" Keanu exhaled through his nose. I think it was the first time I let myself feel all of it. Not just loss, but being seen in the loss. Not judged, just known." He opened the Bible again and placed his hand over the verses like anchoring himself. "When I got to that line, 'Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted,' I didn't read it like poetry. I read it like survival. Like maybe grief wasn't something to escape. Maybe it was the doorway. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, reverent. Jonathan felt it too. He looked down, steadying his own breath. Keanu broke the stillness again. "I think our culture teaches us to numb, to detach, to rationalize everything until it doesn't touch us. But Jesus doesn't numb anything. He walks into the pain. He sits with it. He blesses it. That's radical. That's wild." He let out a breath and shook his head. "I wasn't ready for that kind of love, not for a long time. But now, I think I crave it more than anything. Not to be rescued from pain, but to be met in it." Jonathan placed a hand on the Bible, mirroring Keanu's. "That's what drew me to playing Jesus," he said. "Not just the miracles, but the man who cried at his friend's grave." Keanu nodded. "That's the turning point right there." Keanu looked down again, thumbing the corner of the page as if the paper itself could steady him. "When I first started reading the Beatitudes, I didn't know how to let them reach me. I kept reading them like proverbs. But something shifted. I started reading them like a mirror." Jonathan leaned in. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I saw myself in them. Not the strong one, not the hero, but the one mourning, the one hungry for something more, the one who had nothing left but still hadn't given up. There was a long pause before Keanu said, "I think that's what faith is. Not certainty, not perfect theology, just refusing to stop reaching. When everything in you wants to shut down." He turned another page. There's another part, later in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "That one's tough." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, especially when the person who hurt you is someone you once needed." Jonathan didn't push. He knew what name was hanging unspoken between them. "I used to think forgiveness was weakness," Keanu said. "That it meant letting someone off the hook. But the Gospels don't talk about it that way. Jesus forgives in the middle of being crucified. Not after, not once it's all resolved. In the middle." He folded his hands again. "That tells me something about God, about who He really is. He doesn't wait for us to be ready. He doesn't wait until we apologize. He forgives while we're still breaking Him." Jonathan sat back for a moment, struck silent by the weight of that truth. "And that kind of forgiveness," Keanu added, "doesn't just free the person being forgiven. It frees the one doing it." The camera crew stayed still. The audience in the studio remained quiet. The same quiet that follows a confession in a sacred space. Not entertainment, not drama. Something deeper, something real. Keanu continued. "We spend so much of our lives holding on to pain like it defines us. We turn it into an identity. But the more I read Matthew 5, the more I hear Jesus saying, 'You are not what's been done to you. You are not the worst thing you've ever carried. You are seen and you are blessed, even in that pain.'" Jonathan tilted his head. "That's the opposite of everything we're taught." "I know," Keanu said. "But it's also the first thing that's ever felt like real freedom." He paused again, then smiled faintly. "It doesn't come all at once. It's like healing in layers. But every time I reread the Beatitudes, I feel something open again. Some old wound that stops closing off and starts breathing." Jonathan wiped at one corner of his eye, not from performance, but from the honesty in front of him. "Do you think that's what Jesus meant when He said the kingdom belongs to the poor in spirit?" Keanu didn't hesitate. "I think it means the ones who've been broken open are the ones who know how to receive love without pretense. They're not trying to prove anything anymore. They're just willing to be held." The room grew still again, not from emptiness, but fullness. And then Keanu whispered, "I think I've spent most of my life trying not to need that. But I do, and I think we all do." Keanu sat in stillness for a long moment. His hands rested gently in his lap, the edge of a well-worn Bible brushing against his thumb. The room held its breath. Jonathan didn't press. He could see something forming behind Keanu's quiet eyes. Something raw, something sacred. Then Keanu spoke. Her name was Ava. The name alone seemed to shift the air. "She was stillborn," he continued, his voice steady but soft. "We found out late in the pregnancy that something was wrong. The doctors weren't sure what would happen. We hoped, we held on, but..." He trailed off, his breath catching. "I didn't grow up knowing how to pray. But that night in the hospital, I prayed anyway. I didn't know who I was praying to. I just knew I didn't want her to leave without ever opening her eyes." He looked down for a moment. "They landed her to me wrapped in this tiny pink blanket. She was so small, beautiful, still. Her lips were parted like she had something to say, and I kept waiting, hoping maybe she'd move, cry, something." A tear slid down his cheek. She didn't, and in that moment, I wasn't an actor. I wasn't strong. I was just a man, breaking. Jonathan didn't speak. The crew didn't move. I whispered to her, "I'm sorry. I should have protected you." I remembered those words more clearly than anything I've ever said, because I meant them with every fiber of who I was. He paused. And for years I believed that was it, that holding her was the last page in her story, that I'd never get to know who she might have become. The lights above dimmed slightly, as if the room itself bowed in respect. I couldn't talk about her. I didn't know how. And grief like that, it builds walls. It teaches you how to hide. He glanced at the Bible in his hands. I kept this for years. It was my grandfather's. I never opened it, not once, until one night after everything happened in Berlin, and the first page it fell open to. Keanu flipped slowly to the bookmarked page, his fingers almost trembling. John 11, verse 25. He read it aloud. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Keanu closed the Bible gently. I'd heard that verse before, movies, funerals, but that night, it wasn't just scripture, it was a door. He looked at Jonathan. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe it wasn't the end, that holding Ava wasn't a goodbye. It was a pause. Jonathan's voice came, low and trembling. Keanu shook his head gently. No, that's resurrection. He inhaled deeply, as if the weight of that truth had changed something in his lungs. I used to picture her as a frozen moment, a name carved into grief. But now, I see her running, laughing, free. The silence in the room was thick with something unspoken. She's not lost to me anymore. She's just waiting. Jonathan leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. That image, he said softly, of her not being lost, but waiting. That's one of the most powerful things I've ever heard. Keanu nodded, eyes glistening. It didn't come to me all at once. It was a slow process. Some nights, I still sit in the quiet and the sadness creeps in. But the difference now is, I let it. I sit with it. I don't shove it away like I used to. Because now, I know I'm not sitting in it alone. He paused. Before, grief was something I tried to conquer. Now, it's something I let be seen. Jonathan took a breath and said, so many people watching this have children they've lost, or dreams that died before they ever lived. What would you say to them? Keanu looked down, then back up. That grief isn't weakness, that it's sacred, that it's seen, and most of all, that it doesn't have to be the end. He ran his fingers over the spine of the Bible. I used to think the pain was what I had left of her, that if I let it go, I'd be letting her go. But that's a lie. The pain is not my daughter, the love is. Jonathan swallowed, his voice faltering slightly. That distinction, that's everything. Keanu nodded. And love, real love, doesn't disappear. It transforms. I believe now that's what resurrection really means. Not just coming back to life, but the idea that nothing pure is ever wasted, nothing good is ever lost for good. He glanced toward the studio lights, his face illuminated not just by bulbs but by something deeper. I stopped asking why did I lose her and started asking, what if I haven't? The silence after that was reverent. Jonathan's voice returned, tender and hushed. You said something earlier about not being alone with your grief anymore. Yes. Keanu rested his hands again. For so long I thought healing meant forgetting, moving on, but that only buried the pain deeper. What changed for me was Jesus, not just the name or the religion, but the presence. Jonathan listened closely. Never said, you won't suffer. He never promised the absence of pain. What he promised was, I'll be with you in it. That changes everything, because now, when the ache comes back, I'm not drowning in it alone. He's there. And sometimes, that's enough. Jonathan wiped his eyes quietly, then said, Do you think that's what faith really is? Keanu considered that for a long second. I think it's less about certainty and more about presence. I don't have all the answers, but I know who's holding me when I break. He looked back at the Bible. I held Eva once. That was enough to mark me forever. Now, I believe someone greater is holding her. And one day, I'll hold her again. He said it with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer feared hope. Jonathan didn't respond right away. He didn't need to. The moment spoke louder than any line of dialogue ever could. Keanu leaned back slightly in his chair, letting the silence linger. For the first time in a long time, that silence didn't feel like loss. It felt like love. For a long time, the studio was quiet. Jonathan didn't speak. He didn't need to. His hand rested on his knee, slightly trembling. He blinked quickly, trying to hold back the tears that were now shimmering in the corners of his eyes. The weight of what Keanu had just shared didn't feel like a story. It felt like a confession, a sacred offering. And Jonathan, sitting just a few feet away, wasn't acting anymore. He was bearing witness. He turned his head slowly, glancing toward Keanu, his voice just above a whisper. Thank you. Keanu looked up, surprised by how fragile that single word felt. Jonathan continued, his throat tight. You've just said what millions of people feel but don't know how to say. You gave grief a voice, and not just pain. But what comes after it? Keanu didn't say anything for a moment. Then he smiled gently, humbly. It's not mine, he said. I just finally stopped resisting it. The crew behind the cameras stood still, many of them wiping their eyes. The sound team, the lighting technician, even the floor manager. No one moved like they usually would at this point. There was something in the room that none of them wanted to break. Jonathan leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. I've played Jesus on screen, he said quietly, but I've never heard someone make him feel so real. Keanu's eyes softened. I didn't find him in theology or sermons. I found him in the silence I never wanted to face. That's why it's real, Jonathan said. It wasn't handed to you, it found you. Keanu nodded slowly, as if receiving the words not just with his ears, but with something deeper. Then he added, I think it had been finding me for a long time. I just wasn't ready to stop running. Jonathan turned his head, visibly emotional. You think grief led you to him? Keanu paused. I think he was in the grief, waiting, never forcing, never pushing, just waiting until I could see him. The two men sat in silence again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't sorrowful. It was full, whole, like a wound that still hurt, but was no longer festering. The kind of silence that holds presence. The kind that says, you're not alone. Across the studio, a woman seated near the front of the audience reached into her bag for a tissue. Beside her, a man who had sat rigid through the entire interview now had his head bowed, his hand clenched gently over his mouth. Jonathan finally broke the quiet, his voice unsteady but strong. You know what you've done here, Keanu? Keanu glanced at him, unsure how to respond. You gave permission, Jonathan said, for people to stop pretending, for people to sit in their sorrow and realize it doesn't disqualify them from love or from God. Keanu looked away briefly, then nodded. It's strange. The more honest I became about my pain, the more peace I started to feel. Not because it went away, but because it was finally seen. And that's what changes people. Jonathan wiped a tear from his cheek. It changed me tonight. Keanu let the moment settle. He didn't rush to fill it. For years he'd avoided this kind of space, the soft, vulnerable silence that followed truth. But now he respected it. Let it breathe. I've spent most of my life thinking strength was silence, he said finally. that the way to survive was to carry it all without ever letting anyone see what it was doing to me. Jonathan nodded slowly, his face reflecting that familiar ache. "But what I've learned," Keanu continued, "is that silence can either be a prison or a prayer." Jonathan looked over, startled by the weight of the phrase. That's beautiful. It's what I've felt these last few months," Keanu explained. "Reading the Gospels, sitting with grief instead of outrunning it. It's like Jesus doesn't break the silence. He joins you in it. Like he's been there the whole time." Jonathan wiped under his eye again, not even trying to hide it anymore. That line, "Grief shared becomes lighter." I've heard it before, but I think this is the first time I've actually felt it. Keanu smiled, but there was sadness in it too. I used to think people needed advice when they were hurting. Now, I think what they really need is presence. He folded his hands together, letting them rest on the table between them. "Sometimes healing begins when someone just stays," Keanu said. "That's what you're doing now," Jonathan whispered. "You're staying, even when it hurts." Keanu's voice dropped into a tone that trembled with truth. "And the more I stay, the more I feel like something sacred is happening in the pain. Not after it, not beyond it, but right in the center of it." From the back of the room, a soft voice spoke aloud. No one saw who said it, but the words were clear. "Amen." Jonathan looked up, startled and deeply moved. It wasn't part of the script. It wasn't planted. It was just someone in the room who couldn't stay silent anymore. And that, somehow, made the moment even more holy. "I don't know what tomorrow looks like," Keanu admitted. "But I know that I don't want to go back to pretending I'm fine when I'm not. I don't want to keep hiding the parts of me that still ache." Jonathan reached over, not theatrically, not for the cameras, just as one human being reaching for another, and placed his hand on Keanu's shoulder. "You're not alone in that," he said. Keanu looked him in the eye. "That's the difference Jesus made. I used to think being seen would mean being judged. Now I think it just means being loved." The studio was silent again, but not empty. The quiet felt like something alive, something sacred. "Tonight," Jonathan said, voice hushed, "you didn't just share a testimony. You gave us all an invitation." "To what?" Keanu asked. "To stop hiding," Jonathan replied. "To let sorrow breathe. To believe that maybe, just maybe, grief can become holy." Keanu didn't speak. He just nodded. A single, deep, reverent nod. And in that small movement, the studio felt like church. The studio had gone quiet again. Not the forced silence of production, but something gentler, a kind of breathlessness. Keanu leaned forward slightly, fingers laced together. His voice was soft, not dramatic, but steady. "There are 3 questions that haunted me," he said, "and they didn't come from a book or a professor or a script. They came in the quiet, when the grief was too loud to ignore." Jonathan turned his body toward him, attentive, hands folded. Keanu glanced upward, then let his gaze fall. "First, does love survive death?" He paused. "For so long, I believed love died with the body. I said comforting things to others, about energy, legacy, memory, but none of it held when I sat alone. Not when I remembered Ava's breath never coming, or River's life cut short, or Jennifer's hand slipping away." His voice trembled, just enough to show he wasn't speaking from theory. "But then," Keanu continued, "I read that Jesus wept at Lazarus' tomb, not just before raising him. He stopped and he wept, even though he knew resurrection was coming." Jonathan's face softened, already knowing where this was going. That broke something in me, because it told me love doesn't end. It grieves, it mourns, it endures. Even God doesn't skip the pain of loss. And that means maybe love survives death. Not in abstraction, but in presence. Jonathan nodded slowly, visibly moved. The second question, Keanu said, was tougher. He inhaled, then released it slowly. Can meaning rise from meaningless pain? He sat with that one. So did the room. For years, I tried to find a philosophy that could answer that. Buddhism helped me let go. Stoicism helped me endure. But Jesus walked into pain and didn't come out preaching detachment. He didn't explain suffering away. He entered it, and when I read the Gospels, really read them, I saw a man who turned wounds into doorways. Keanu looked to Jonathan. That's different. That's not endurance. That's transformation. Jonathan whispered, that's redemption. Keanu gave a small nod. Exactly. Redemption. The word hovered like incense. And a third question? Keanu's voice softened even more. Is there someone beyond all this holding it together? He let the question hang longer than the others. When life falls apart, when I couldn't fix the pain, couldn't rewind time, couldn't bring them back, I needed to believe there was someone who could hold what I couldn't. He looked at Jonathan again. I used to believe the universe was silent, but now I think maybe it's been whispering all along. Jonathan sat back, hands clasped in front of his mouth. His eyes were glassy. And the answer to all three, Keanu said, didn't come as a theory, it came as a person. He reached for the Bible resting beside him and gently tapped it. Jesus didn't offer ideas, he offered himself. A hush fell over the studio again, and in the silence, Jonathan finally spoke. Amen. Keanu held the Bible in his hands for a moment, as if the weight of it had changed since this journey began. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The truth he had found wasn't about pages, it was about presence. He continued slowly. I know some people hear these questions, about love, about pain, about someone holding the universe, and they think they're too big, too abstract. But when you've lost what I've lost, when you've carried it quietly for decades, they stop being abstract. They become survival. Jonathan whispered, and you survived. Keanu gave a quiet, honest nod. Barely, sometimes, but yes. Then he leaned forward again, hands now resting on his knees. Do I believe love survives death? Yes. Not just as a feeling or a memory, but as something eternal. Ava is still loved. River is still loved. That love didn't disappear, it deepened. It waits. He paused. Do I believe meaning can rise from meaningless pain? Now, I do. Because if Jesus could take the worst instrument of death, the cross, and turn it into the symbol of hope, then nothing is wasted, not even our grief. Jonathan took a deep breath. His hands trembled slightly. And as for the third, Keanu said quietly, is someone holding it all together? He looked straight ahead, eyes unwavering. I've come to believe, yes, not just someone, but someone who weeps, who walks with us, who sits with us in the wreckage, who doesn't run from the questions, who doesn't offer easy answers, but offers himself. Jonathan's voice cracked, barely audible. That's the difference. Keanu nodded. That's what I missed for years. I thought I needed answers, but what I needed was presence. I needed someone who didn't flinch at my pain, who could sit with the questions and still say, I'm here. The audience remained still, held in the depth of the moment. No shifting chairs, no throat clearing, just the sound of someone in the second row softly weeping. Jonathan leaned closer, his voice full of quiet wonder. And that's what Jesus did. Yes, Keanu said. Not a message, not a lesson, a person. He exhaled slowly, letting the silence speak where words couldn't reach. I think for the first time in my life, he added, I don't feel like I have to carry all this alone. I used to think grief was my burden to bear forever. But now, it feels like something I'm allowed to bring to him. Over and over again. There was a pause. A long, sacred pause. Then Jonathan looked at him, eyes misted. That's not just faith, that's freedom. Keanu smiled faintly, humbled. I'm still learning, still surrendering, but yes, freedom. Not because I earned it, because it was offered. He gently closed the Bible, resting his hand on top. In a world that celebrates control, it's strange to say this, but the safest I've ever felt was the moment I let go. Jonathan leaned back, overcome, wiping his eyes without shame. A final hush settled over the room. Keanu looked toward him, then gently spoke the words that had changed his life. Love survives, meaning rises, and someone is holding it all. And in that silence, the truth lingered, not as performance, but as peace. The cold air in Berlin hit differently this time. Months had passed since the night that changed Keanu's life, but as he stepped out of the car and looked up at the gray clouds pressing over the city, it didn't feel heavy, not like before. There was a stillness in the breeze. Not silent, not empty, but peaceful, familiar. Keanu didn't come with a film crew. No production schedule, no hotel concierge waiting. Just him and a small satchel on his shoulder. Inside was a folded paper, creased from how many times he'd opened it and rewritten it, and the Bible, his grandfather's, tucked next to it, worn, underlined, marked with quiet revelations. He made his way on foot, retracing his steps from that winter night. The alley where he stopped to cry after filming a scene too close to real grief. The church he passed but never entered. The bookstore where he once bought a novel to escape the world. They were still here, but they no longer spoke the same language to him. Back then, he'd carried his pain like armor. Now, he let it breathe. He paused at a crosswalk near the hospital. He recognized it instantly, though the color of the door had changed. The bench outside was still there, same iron frame, same chipped wood. He sat slowly. No one noticed, which is what he preferred. The sun peeked out briefly. He reached into his bag, pulled out the note, and opened it one last time to reread what he had written. You are seen, you are not alone. He didn't know who would find it, but he knew someone would. It wasn't a grand act. It wasn't about being remembered. It was about remembering what had changed him. The night he felt held. The voice that had whispered meaning into his suffering. He folded the paper again, smaller this time, slipped it beneath the bench where the legs met the frame, just visible if someone looked closely. That's how grace works, he thought. You don't always notice it, until you're the one looking for it. A nurse walked by, eyes tired, her scrubs wrinkled. She slowed, glanced at him briefly, then moved on. Keanu didn't say a word. A few minutes later, an older man, maybe in his 60s, sat on the other end of the bench. He didn't speak either, just sighed heavily and kept his gaze down. The man rubbed his hands together, fidgeted, then bent forward to tie his shoe. That's when he noticed the paper. Keanu stayed quiet, watching without staring. The man picked up the note, read it once, then again. His lips parted slightly, as if trying to form a word that wouldn't come. Then he smiled. Not a wide grin, just a softened face, like a long breath had finally been exhaled. He didn't look around. He didn't ask questions. He folded the paper once more, slid it into his coat pocket, and walked away. Keanu sat there for a while longer. The note was gone, but the message stayed. The hospital, behind the bench, wasn't the kind of place tourists visited. It was a local facility, simple, utilitarian, worn by time and weather. Yet, for Keanu, it had become a symbol, not just of that night, but of every unanswered question he'd ever asked in the silence of grief. He stood and walked toward the side entrance. He remembered pacing these sidewalks months ago, unsure of what he was searching for. Maybe he still didn't know. But this time, he didn't walk with weight. He walked with intention. Inside the lobby, little had changed. The same vending machines hummed by the wall. A child's drawing still hung near the elevator, sunflowers with faces and lopsided smiles. Keanu studied it for a moment, not for its art, for the hope it carried. He didn't go upstairs. He didn't ask for a name. He didn't need to. The visit wasn't for him to be recognized. It was to recognize others. Down the corridor, a janitor pushed a mop bucket slowly. Their eyes met briefly. Keanu nodded once. The man nodded back. There was something sacred about walking unnoticed. Not because Keanu feared fame, but because the sacred moments, he'd come to learn, were often quiet, unseen. He slipped into the chapel, a small, square room on the first floor, tucked between two nurse stations. Rows of wooden pews, a few prayer books, and a single flickering candle up front. No one was there. He took a seat in the back row and let the silence settle. Memories rushed in, of Ava, of Jennifer, of River, of his own father. They didn't come like waves crashing, they came like a slow tide, gentle, heavy, but no longer drowning him. He reached into his satchel and pulled out the Bible. It fell open, not by force, but by habit, to a verse he'd marked just days earlier. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." The words didn't hit like poetry anymore. They hit like a promise. Keanu closed his eyes, not to escape, but to lean in. He whispered a prayer. Not one rehearsed, not one memorized. Just a few words he hadn't been able to say for years. "Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." The door creaked open. He turned slightly. A nurse stepped in, surprised to see someone inside. She offered a polite smile and began to step back out. Keanu nodded. "You can stay." She entered quietly and sat a few rows ahead. For a while, they said nothing. Then she whispered almost to herself, "Lost my mom last week. Still feels like it didn't happen." Keanu nodded gently. "I'm sorry," he said. The only words that ever felt right in moments like that. The nurse stared straight ahead. People try to fix it, or change the subject. But the silence always feels more honest. Keanu didn't respond. He didn't need to. His presence was his response. The candle up front danced slightly. He stayed until she left, not because he had something more to offer, but because staying, that was enough. The studio lights had long dimmed, but the conversation never left Keanu. Months had passed since that raw exchange with Jonathan Roumie, and while it hadn't been part of a press tour or scripted appearance, it left a deeper mark on Keanu's path than any movie premiere ever had. He didn't walk away from that night the same man. Something had shifted, not just inwardly, but in how he showed up in the world. One of the first changes came quietly. Keanu began turning down roles that once would have excited him. Explosive action blockbusters, revenge-driven scripts, characters fueled by anger and isolation. He still respected the genre. He owed a great deal to it, but something in his soul had outgrown it. "I used to think stories needed explosions," he said in a recent private conversation with a friend. "Now I think they need truth." It wasn't about preaching, it was about depth. About telling stories where people didn't just survive, but healed. Roles where characters wrestled with grief, faith, forgiveness. Not in ways that tied things up with a bow, but in ways that felt honest. That shift in mindset began to reflect in the scripts he chose. In one film, he played a widowed father rebuilding a community library his daughter once dreamed of. In another, he took on the role of a quiet caretaker in a hospice facility. No action scenes, no stunts, just stillness and presence. Both scripts had been sitting untouched in a drawer, passed over by bigger stars. Keanu dusted them off. "These are the stories I want to tell now," he said. stories that hold people's pain with care. But it didn't stop with acting. Keanu also started supporting grief foundations more actively, though, as always, quietly. He made sizable donations to nonprofits helping bereaved parents, but insisted his name be left off the public donor lists. What mattered to him wasn't recognition, it was impact. One of those foundations eventually reached out, asking if he'd speak at a private retreat for fathers who had lost children. Keanu didn't speak from a stage. He simply sat in the back row, listening. At one point, a man who had lost a son to leukemia turned to him and asked, "Do you ever stop missing them?" Keanu looked him in the eyes and said gently, "No, but I've started missing her with hope instead of despair." That moment planted a seed, one that became something far bigger than he anticipated. It was called Presence, a non-profit built not around fundraising events or media coverage, but around a simple principle: showing up. Its mission was to train volunteers to be what Keanu had tried to be since Berlin, not problem solvers, not counselors, just people who knew how to sit with others in their darkest hour. No fixing, no saving, just presence. He launched it without fanfare, a soft website, a few trusted partners. Then word spread, not through headlines, but through whispered stories. A grieving mother who found a presence volunteer waiting with a thermos of tea and a blanket on her porch. A teenager who hadn't spoken since his brother died, slowly opening up during weekly walks, with a volunteer who didn't push him, just walked beside him. Keanu didn't want to be the face of the organization, but he showed up regularly, quietly, often without being noticed. Just another man in the circle. Just another heart trying to hold space for someone else's pain. A presence grew not through fame, but through resonance. People didn't talk about Keanu's involvement at first. They talked about what it felt like to be heard, really heard, by someone who didn't flinch at sadness. One volunteer described it this way: "It's not about saying the right thing. It's about not running away when nothing can be said." Keanu's influence on the mission was deep but subtle. He never wrote lengthy mission statements or filmed glossy promos. Instead, he helped shape Presence around a question that had once haunted him. What would have helped me feel less alone in my grief? The answers became Presence's training philosophy. Things like how to hold space in silence, how to resist the urge to fill pain with platitudes, how to simply stay, even when it's awkward, uncomfortable, or heavy. Keanu often reminded his small team, "The most healing thing I've ever received wasn't advice, it was someone refusing to leave." He began writing short, handwritten letters that Presence volunteers could give families if asked. Simple messages like, "Your pain is valid. You are not forgotten. Grief is not a weakness. It's love with nowhere to go." One of the most requested notes said simply, "You are still a parent, even now." That one Keanu had written the night before Ava's birthday. The project wasn't large. There were no headquarters, no celebrity partnerships, but the stories coming out of it were undeniable. A father in Montana who had lost his daughter to suicide wrote to Presence and said, "You didn't bring my daughter back, but you brought me back to my son." One of the volunteers later admitted she joined because of John Wick. "I thought I'd meet Keanu," she joked. "Instead, I met grief in others and learned how to stop hiding from mine." As the nonprofit grew, Keanu continued working, but his work looked different now. When offered a franchise reboot of one of his old action roles, he turned it down, saying simply, "I'm in a different story now." Instead, he helped produce a quiet indie film based on the life of a hospice nurse. He took a small supporting role playing the janitor who always showed up early, stayed late, and never said much. The crew later said he gave the same attention to that role as he did to The Matrix. "I'm not trying to be a savior," Keanu told a group of Presence volunteers during one of their gatherings. "I just know what it feels like to suffer in silence, And I don't think silence should have the last word. The volunteers agreed. They had seen firsthand what it meant to enter a home that had known only grief and bring stillness that wasn't empty, but filled with care. Their presence slowly expanded to include workshops for hospitals, schools, and even studios. Keanu helped design a session for filmmakers titled Grief on Screen: How We Portray Suffering Matters. He believed deeply that the stories we tell shape the way we see the world, and that meant they came with responsibility. He wasn't trying to erase darkness from his roles, but now he said, "I want the darkness to mean something. I want it to point toward the light." His choices were quieter now, more intentional, less explosive, but somehow more powerful than ever. Because when a man who's known great loss chooses to help others carry theirs, the world notices, even if he doesn't ask it to. The studio had gone still. After the final wrap signal, there was no applause, no sudden rush of crew chatter. Just a soft silence, like the air itself had been changed by what had taken place. As the lights dimmed, Keanu Reeves stepped off the set, not with the briskness of a celebrity wrapping a press tour, but with the quiet of a man who had just opened a sealed part of his soul. Jonathan Roumie followed a few steps behind. They didn't speak right away. Sometimes words only dilute what silence holds best. Outside, the air was cooler. The city around them moved in its usual rhythm, oblivious to what had been shared in that small, quiet space. But for Keanu and Jonathan, something had shifted. The doors of the studio closed behind them as they walked side by side down the narrow street, lit only by the soft amber glow of a single street lamp overhead. They stopped beneath it. Jonathan looked over, unsure if Keanu would say anything more. Keanu finally spoke, his voice low, steady. This wasn't just an interview, he said. It was a confession. Jonathan's eyes softened. He didn't press, didn't respond with affirmation or pity. He just stood beside him, quietly letting the truth settle. Keanu's gaze lifted toward the halo of the street lamp. "You know," he continued, "for years I thought grief was something to get through, something to conquer. I'd carry it like a badge, then I'd pretend I didn't feel it, or I'd use it to fuel my work. I thought that was strength." Jonathan listened, hands in his pockets, his silence a kind of reverent respect. "But now," Keanu paused, "now I think it's something else. I think grief is a doorway." Jonathan blinked. "A doorway into what?" Keanu exhaled slowly, as if the answer wasn't words but breath itself. "Into redemption. Into meaning. Into the kind of hope that doesn't erase pain, but walks beside it." They stood there for a while, both men looking at the street, the empty sidewalk, the quiet stillness that felt almost holy. Then Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small white candle. Jonathan tilted his head, watching without asking. "I brought it this morning," Keanu said, softly. "Didn't know why, but now I do." He crossed the street slowly toward a small chapel tucked between two buildings. The door was open, lights dimmed inside. No one there, just a humble altar and a space for quiet. Keanu walked to the front, knelt for a moment, and lit the candle. He didn't pray aloud. He didn't make a show of it. He just let the flame flicker. Then he stood and stepped back. There were no speeches, no captions, no dramatic score, just presence. And in that still moment, as the candle glowed in the darkened chapel, the final voiceover began. What if the grief we carry isn't the end of the story, but the doorway into redemption? Keanu stood in the back pew now, his head lowered, eyes reflecting the flame. "I still have grief," his voice said in quiet narration. "But now, I have grace beside it." Outside the chapel, the night had deepened. Streetlights cast soft golden halos over the cobblestone path where Jonathan and Keanu now stood, quiet and unhurried. The sound of the city had faded into the distance, replaced by something deeper: stillness. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, the kind that feels sacred. Jonathan broke it gently. "Do you think sharing all that changed anything?" Keanu looked down at his hands, slowly rubbing one thumb over the other. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I think something changed in me." Jonathan waited. Keanu took a breath. "For so long I thought healing meant silence, that if I just kept quiet, kept working, kept being useful, the grief would fade." He turned his eyes to the distant windows of the chapel, where the candle he left flickered in soft defiance of the dark. "But I'm starting to realize it's not about silence, it's about presence." Jonathan nodded slowly. "I didn't come here tonight to make a statement," Keanu said. "I came because I had to stop hiding what I actually believe. Not the vague kind of belief that's easy to digest, but the real kind, the kind that costs something." His voice was steady but tender. "I believe Jesus is who he said he is, and I believe he met me in my grief, not to take it away, but to walk through it with me." There was no applause, no dramatic music, just the quiet hum of wind moving through the trees. Jonathan said, "That's not a message, Keanu. That's a testimony." Keanu gave a faint smile. "Feels more like a confession." The two men stood side by side, not saying much more, not needing to. Inside the chapel, the candle's glow danced softly against the stone walls. Outside, the street lamp hummed, casting its light not just on them, but on the moment itself. A moment that wasn't polished, but it was real. In a final voiceover, the words settled gently. "What if the grief we carry isn't the end of the story, but the doorway into redemption?" As Keanu steps back into the chapel alone, he kneels for a brief moment, not in performance, but in peace. The camera doesn't linger. It just holds the image. A man, a flame, a silence that feels like healing. No sermon, no spectacle, just the quiet truth of someone who stopped running and chose to stay. He places one hand on the edge of the wooden pew, then rises. No rush, no music, just presence. The candle remains, flickering behind him, like a reminder that grief may not go away, but grace can live beside it. Final line: "I still have grief, but now I have grace beside it." Call to action, CT. Have you ever experienced pain that changed your view of life or faith? Share it in the comments. And if you believe stories like this matter, subscribe for more. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones that shout, they're the ones that simply tell the truth.